having me. Hello to old friends and new friends in the room. Um, Thank you for taking time out of what I know is a busy life to be here today. As promised, the topic of the evening is social emotional learning as pedagogy. And I should give you a little bit of background. The first thing I want to say is yes, I'm a university professor, and I, yes, this is one of my specialties in the academic environment. However, that doesn't mean I'm an expert in your life, your mind, your world, and your experiences. And so I really hope we'll have enough time tonight to get into some of the sharings of what you have learned about this, because I'm amongst my peers here. I'm with other teachers. And so I feel the richness of the exchange is very important to me, so that it's not just about my title imbuing me with the most time on the microphone. You know what I mean? It's that kind of like academic arrogance that I just can't get down with. I'd much rather make sure it's an exchange. And at the university, I spent the last academic year doing a special assignment as a faculty research fellow in our Center for Teaching and Learning. That's kind of like a pedagogy center on our campus. And I'm also the head of pedagogy for our dance department. Pedagogy is really the science of teaching and learning. And for all of my expertise, that doesn't mean I get it right in the classroom every time. And frequently, matter of fact, even this last semester when I got my evaluations from students back, they downgraded me on a couple of things that I deliberately experimented with. And they wanted their conventions back and they didn't get what they wanted. And so I'm constantly playing, and I always feel there's some vulnerability in that, and that there's a potential to disappoint people and and just to be very blunt, piss people off, right? And so what I'm going to be talking about tonight are not intended to be fail-safe tools, but instead things that you can decide whether or not they align with your temperament, with your interests, and things that do have science and research behind them. But ultimately, you have to know whether or not the tool aligns with how you wish to conduct yourself as an instructor in the classroom. I'm going to share my screen. And I assume you all can see slides now. The first thing that I'd like to do is let you know that everything that I do comes from a personal commitment to address racism, bias, discrimination, and inequality. And if we're going to do that sincerely, to me, there are 4 levels of engagement to deconstructing colonialism and racism. The first is the personal level, which means I'm always looking at myself. I'm self-examining where my programming and my indoctrinations are maybe getting in the way. I'm always looking at the interpersonal, what kind of diplomacy skill sets I'm employing, what kind of allyship I'm giving others who haven't walked in the same journey that I have or have different identities. Then I'm always considering the communal. I'm looking at regional demographics and the norms and practices of a given region, because those create expectations that are like a hidden curriculum. And then I'm always looking at the structural and systemic policies that parameter our reality. So the policies and the legal guidelines. My litmus test for everything is, does it reflect our emerging global citizenship? How does it help us to reconfigure our understanding as a human family, not just as Americans or as women, or for me as an African American or a Creole woman or any of those things? Those identities mean an awful lot to me, but my litmus test for whether or not a tool is impactful in pedagogy, in the science of teaching and learning, is whether or not it would hold up to global citizenship. And that's really, really my perspective. And in doing that, may I please let you know that as a CU Boulder employee and a global citizen, I want to acknowledge that I'm operating on the unceded territories of the Inono'ei, or Arapaho, and Cheyenne and Ute nations, according to the 1851 Treaty of Fort Laramie. Because Colorado, where I live, is home to 48 contemporary tribal sovereign nations that are historically tied to these lands. And then I offer tribute to my own people, the Choctaw and the Coushatta, for the generosity and coalition they built with my African ancestors, whom were subjected to slavery. This is my pedagogy pledge from my syllabus at the college. So I'm just going to rip through it nice and quick. My pledge to you. I will be encouraging and humorous in my offerings. I will explain thoughtfully and clearly. I will offer citation for what I have learned and concede openly what I have not yet learned. I will ensure a welcoming, judgment-free, and inviting environment where counterpoint ideas can be exchanged diplomatically. Our discussion will welcome new ideas and perspectives, and I will remain receptive to these concepts changing and transforming based on my interactions with you. Please, therefore, let me know if you perceive glaring holes and negligence in any of my research. I intend to give you tools to increase your conversancy and expand your boundaries, and above all, nurture independence from me. Because I have no interest in telling you what to think. Rather, please know I'm passionate about helping you to ask better questions without interference from our socially indoctrinated filters. I will respect our differences in and out of this conversation because your dignity and comfort are important to me. And in return, I ask for your courage, your diplomacy, your open thinking, and your active involvement. I hold myself accountable to the same caliber and standards I am requesting of you, and my pronouns are she and they. I will share this slide just about every time that we're together during this series to give us a reminder of what culture is, because so much of what we're discussing has a foundation in cultural difference and cultural similarity. This is my definition of culture because I couldn't find one that I felt was adequate. Culture is a categorical display of customs, attire, language, norms, and values that signify membership to a defined and recognizable group. So cultures can be grouped by nationality or ethnicity, but beyond that, self-selected membership. And those are things that were not studied in the past. So you can have subcultures within nationalities. And there are many humans that negotiate overlapping identities amongst several categories of belonging. So that means that I am a Black woman, I'm a Creole woman, I'm a Native and Indigenous woman, I'm a mom, I'm an artist, I'm an educator. And each of those identities has its own culture, right? You've got gamer culture, you've got skater culture, you've got art culture, and you've got all kinds of isms. And each of those things carries weight in my personality and my identity, and they come into play as an instructor. But there's something that's very important, signature values. Those are the defining, consistent, and recognizable priorities that are expressed by members of a culture. And it can be through repeating motifs and themes, through their aesthetics and values. These are priorities that are legible through their mutual norms and languages, movement, attire, cuisine, music, and nonverbal communication. And they're both implicit and explicit practices. Signature values differ from stereotypes. They can become stereotypes. What we know about stereotypes culturally is they may have some truth to them. But when people are reduced to a signature value and not allowed the complexity of all that they are, that's when the signature values start to become weaponized against people, right? I could story tell about that. I think you got the point. So I'll just go ahead and move on. Let me know if you do have a question about anything. I forgot to mention that. Interrupt me with questions. You'll see this slide frequently as well. Norms. Norms are the way that we workshop our values, right? And they are dynamic in that they are constructed, affirmed, preserved, subverted, defied, suppressed, innovated, and reimagined on a perpetual basis. So to say that any aspect of culture is unchanging is just simply not true. All culture transforms, or it becomes a relic and a museum piece. If it's to live, breathe, and be relevant to a living people, then it will transform with each generation of participants that engages with it. Who engages with it? I had to correct my grammar there. My definition of dance is meaningful, patterned movement. And I had to define it this way from working in European-based institutions, Eurocentric institutions that kept comparing everything to ballet. And I had to say, all right, can we stop that? What is dance to the rest of the world? Yeah. And so every single culture of dance has its own technique. And for me, technique is the ability to replicate any movement with increasing efficiency and proficiency. So every single dance culture has its own definition of how the body is held in relationship to gravity, how the mechanics of movement are engineered. They have their own fundamentals, their own defined alignment, and how they define dynamics. They have their own sense of what's correct and what's not. And it's usually modeled after virtuosic dancers. They have their own intentionality and communication. It may be literal or narrative or just implied, but dance communicates something within all cultures. And each culture has its own benchmarks for mastering skills and thresholds of proficiency. Someone can look at it and say, yes, that honors the tradition, or they can look at it and say, not really, right? And so what's our positionality? Our positionality as instructors means what are the ways in which our identity interacts with, influences, relays with the way that we see any issue, especially issues of authority in the classroom, right? So positionality is the ways in which your socioeconomic background, the way you were socially indoctrinated, how you were brought up, your current age, your way of expressing your own gender, your physical or neurological ability or different ability, your sexual orientation, your religious and belief affiliation, your ethnicity, and everything else that makes up your identity means that every time you interact with an issue, the constellation of variables that make up you interact uniquely with that information. So we call that your positionality. From your position, your vantage point in the world, how do you see a particular issue? We are surprisingly different in how we do that. And in talking about being instructors, we have to touch on our understanding of cultural assimilation. We're going to also be talking in future talks about cultural appropriation and other things, but just for tonight, may I please invite you to review this. Cultural assimilation is a choice to abandon or refrain from practices that would distinguish one from a dominant cultural group. It's generally perceived to refer to someone acquiescing to external pressure, giving into, or giving into the imposition of forces outside of their own core culture and identity. So cultural assimilation is usually about someone voluntarily saying, I'm not going to do that anymore because it makes me stand out, or it's not important to me anymore, or I'm interested in this now, right? But it's seen as a choice. It's not really seen as a forced thing in this definition. When we get into our next lecture on cultural appropriation, we're going to talk about some of the power dynamics behind cultural assimilation. But just for tonight, wanted to keep it on the tip of the tongue. As teachers, one of the wonderful things I want to make sure you have an opportunity to know about is Bloom's taxonomy. Bloom's taxonomy is kind of an ordering of skill sets in the classroom. It's not necessarily linear, even though it's presented in a linear format here, but it has a lot to do with how and when we time information. Because whether or not someone's nervous system, mind, and heart can receive the information that we want to give has a lot to do with Bloom's taxonomy. So at the base, right in the purple zone, which is at the bottom of this graphic in case you have any visual differences in color, I wanted to read to you that Bloom starts with just the imparting of knowledge, the ability to remember previously learned information. That's the regurgitation phase of knowledge, right? So it's where someone has the ability to arrange, define, describe, duplicate, identify, label, order, repeat, reproduce, the very basic memory of what you are imparting as a teacher. But when your students get to the place where they really start to embody knowledge, then they move into a phase of comprehension, moving up the graphic into the blue zone, where they start to demonstrate an understanding of the facts. That's where they start to be able to describe, discuss, distinguish, classify, infer, recognize, rewrite, review, summarize, translate, right? It's beyond them just parroting back to you what you've offered. It starts to make coherent sense to them. And as we move up the model, we get to the place where they get to apply the knowledge. So they start to compute, demonstrate, discover, dramatize, employ, illustrate, interpret, manipulate. And that's where we get a lot of folks that are studying in movement, and they get to the point where they start finding an artistic voice. They're like, I have this itch to try this thing and I want to see what it looks like, right? And that's where people get generative and very creative. And as we move up the model of education, we get into analysis. Your students gain the ability to break down objects or ideas into simpler parts and find evidence to support their generalizations. So they're really starting to categorize, compare, analyze, diagram, discriminate, outline, relate, separate, subdivide. They are pulling it apart and really starting to understand things in their bodies, uniquely their bodies specifically, and maybe starting to understand it contextually within the culture in which it's situated. As we move up the model, your students start to synthesize. They can start to compile ideas into whole new ways, new formats, new solutions. So they combine, they comply, compose, generate, plan, prepare, rearrange, reconstruct, right? And as they revise, they start to gain an embodied analysis of common denominators and differences. They're no longer hunting, they're actually in the generation mode. And then as they advance further in their understanding of the material you offer, they can start to evaluate for themselves. They can start to make their own judgments. They assess, they conclude, they discriminate, they evaluate, they judge, they justify, interpret, predict, select, summarize, right? And so Any good teacher, and I know this is going to sound very, very heavy-handed, so please bear with me while I get very opinionated. But if any teacher worth their salt celebrates a student moving through the model and does not compete with their students when they see a student potentially eclipsing them in their understanding and creativity of what's being offered. Because if you've offered it with love and with appreciation for who they are as people, then you get excited when you see them grow. And they, in turn, love you. They appreciate you, and they will offer you tribute for the rest of their days if you stay generous. So I think it's so important to look at this model and say, where are we as individuals in our dancing here? Do we feel comfort, or do we feel criticism when we start to really synthesize and rearrange things? And how do we impart that value and those ideas onto our students? So emotional and social intelligence in the classroom is very much about monitoring ourselves as we are also monitoring the emotions of others, because it is no secret that dance is 10% choreography, 90% emotional content, right? It's very much about engaging the non-verbal intelligence of someone. And you're going to get a lot of baggage with that. Your students will come with glorious baggage. And so that's where our own social emotional sophistication helps us to navigate power differentials and differences in expectations when we're with our students in the classroom. So emotional intelligence has been defined as the accurate ability to perceive, understand, and manage your own emotions and behavior while monitoring others. It's a 40-year-old concept and has many different branches of discourse. And Daniel Goldman, who is the originator of the idea of emotional intelligence, said it's more important than IQ. It's not innate, doesn't come naturally, and it is not unalterable. It is something that can be developed. And it's one language, but it has many dialects because it has so much cultural specificity. There are some important pillars to emotional competency. The first bullet, the ability to perceive and recognize. So it's our interpretation of different nuances. So for example, if someone laughs, they're like, are they laughing because they're amused? Are they laughing because they're freaked out? Are they laughing because they are nervous and scared? Are they laughing because they're confused? So laughter is not universally symbolic of the same thing every time it's offered, right? So your perception and your recognition of a student's emotions means that you're able to tell when something has a nuanced flavor to it, when it's no longer just a laugh, that it's loaded with something else. And that laugh could be a glance, the way questions are languaged, the inflection of the voice, right? And understanding, second bullet, understanding the range of how emotions are utilized. So for example, not everyone smiles when happy. And to understand the meanings using emotions to facilitate our thinking. That is because there is no, and I have combed all of the neuropsychology research out there on this, there is no standardized fingerprint for an emotion that is common between individuals, right? So if I encounter a spider, which I did in my garden, I get a little fascinated and I don't want to get too close, but I really want to study it and and see if I can identify the spider. I'd like to get a picture and I watch it for a little while, and I'm just fascinated. I like learning. If my daughter encounters a spider, freak zone. Freak zone is over. Mom, spider, it's just over. So again, this is how we have the same stimuli, but different emotional responses to it. My dog is looking at me because I was just yelling. She's like, what's the problem? And that's where emotions have a completely different range in each individual based on how we uniquely inhabit our bodies and encounter the world and have been indoctrinated culturally. Third bullet, emotional competency is the ability to regulate and self-monitor. So we use our emotions to facilitate our thinking and manage disruption within ourselves. So it's noticing when you're getting triggered, right, as a teacher. And all of you wonderful teachers in the room, I know you feel me on this. I know you feel me on this because when you get someone in the room who's gonna make your evening a little wonky, right? When you're dealing with someone who gets under your skin in a weird way. When you've got someone who is gonna fixate and make it hard for you to move on, right? So it's when you notice yourself getting triggered, caught up, flagged, that you're able to start self-monitoring and not necessarily create a power dynamic out of the situation by taking it out on the student, right? And it was really helpful for me on that. When I think about all of the immaturities that my own mentor contoured in me, it took her 12 years to get me to a place where I understood fully what she was trying to impart. That was Professor Letitia Williams. 12 years she put up with me. I think about some of the things that came out of my mouth and the ways that I approached issues, and I am so grateful. She never went off on me. She would just be like, well, let's think about that. And then she'd talk me through something and she'd model new thinking for me. I was a hot-headed little snot. I was obnoxious. I might still be, I don't know, but when I think of how much she invested in me and the patience that it took, I see that her own self-regulation was astounding because I was a hard nut to crack. I was unbelievably narrow-minded and stubborn. But that resistance that she worked through was commensurate with the level of transformation that I was capable of. And that makes a good teacher. That every time you get someone who wells up your resistance, it means you've got someone who is also capable of unbelievable transformation. Can you see it through? So it means that we are cultivating our own emotional courage, our stamina for discomfort, our empathy. We are engaging what we define as personal intimacy and vulnerability. Clarity, which for me is the ability to observe, define, and distinguish what you feel. We are building our de-escalation techniques and our diffusion skills so that when we hit points of weirdness, which we will inevitably, we have tools to redirect and to diffuse the situation. So that's one model of emotional social learning. There are many. So here's another one from the Yale Center of Emotional Health. They call it the ruler. R, recognizing emotions in self and others. U, understanding the causes and consequences of emotions. L, labeling emotions accurately. E, expressing emotions appropriately. Appropriately to me might be a little bit of a blind spot in this model because appropriate is culturally defined, right? And R, regulating emotions effectively, the ability to redirect yourself when you start to get triggered. They have an educational model that builds kind of a 3-year, I guess, module. In the first year, teaches families to get their ability to understand and regulate their own emotions up, and to consider and empathize with how others are feeling. In the second year of their model, people start to identify feeling words. They start to try and get a wider range of vocabulary to build their own emotional intelligence and to get a little more nuance with what they identify. In the third year, it's a self-perpetuating program by training teachers and other staff to become trainers of others, so that you impart the skills rather than just act like you're holier than thou and constantly above it all with perfect understanding, but that you actually help build the emotional social intelligence in others. And that's, again, the generosity of being a teacher. But at the heart of it, at the heart of all pedagogy tools, especially social emotional learning, is the power dynamics. So we're thinking about how to understand the unique power differentials in each circumstance or situation, even if it feels very familiar to you, but to treat it as something new. We're looking at ways to move away from oversimplifying and away from binaries of absolutes, notions of right and wrong that don't acknowledge exceptions, and most importantly, people over profits. That can be very hard for those of us who make our living here, right? Where, our comfort, our electricity, the roof over our head depends on our ability to build a clientele, to engage people meaningfully in our artistic passions. And we're looking for a way to acknowledge the hidden and implicit bias that impacts our perceptions and subconscious stories about the world around us. Understanding that our eyes do lie to us, our minds do distort things to us. And how can we excavate down to a more accurate perception of others and the world around us? I've done a lot of training in the field of diplomacy, and in the field of diplomacy, someone's job is to walk into a room and be the person to create common ground, to actually curate common denominators. And that's usually done through the role of questioning rather than telling people about themselves. So when we reduce our arrogance, the ability to build a better question makes us a better diplomat. And so on the left-hand side of this chart, which you may have seen before, because I've included it in other presentations, unhealthy motives in diplomacy or facilitation or instruction, the aim to be right, defend yourself, to look good, save face, win, or punish, blame, insult, devalue others, or avoid conflict just to keep peace, or to have someone feel isolated and ostracized even in your presence. Motives that help build diplomacy: a commitment to learning, a commitment to finding truth, multiple truths, because there may be multiple truths to a given situation. A willingness to always look for results, which means you are data-driven, information-driven in your classroom rather than ego-driven. An effort to be a problem solver, the commitment to build relationships by strengthening them and finding common ground, bridging gaps, and finding ways to coexist. And that means, first of all, listening meaningfully. For me, meaningful listening is a combination of these things that you see on your screen. It's earnest communication, building your attention span, checking for comprehension, building your tracking and your memory in conversation. And all those things combined create deeper listening. So for me, that's when it becomes meaningful. When someone can feel you are sincerely present for them, even if you're not speaking, but that you're attending to them by listening. That means, as well as teachers, we employ intellectual humility. So we're slowing down, trying to listen first, and pausing the inclination to prove anything to anyone. That's hard because teachers in the Eurocentric model perform authority. But the new breed of teacher, if I may use that phrase, the new teacher is someone that says, I don't know. Tell me what you think about that. That's new for me. Will you please tell me more, right? It's constantly saying, I don't have to be the only expert in the room. And the best idea in the room doesn't have to come from me. My job is to keep a rhythm in the room and to keep the information flowing, but to not be necessarily the arrogant expert. It means that we are taking responsibility for our own education. And specifically, this comes into play in cultural pedagogy, which we will also talk about in this series. But it means that members of disenfranchised groups should not be held responsible to provide us elegant tutorials and orientation sessions while they are also managing their own sense of distress. Because it's not uncommon for groups to experience ambassador fatigue, and we shouldn't take it personally. As a teacher, this usually comes into play when students present us with a boundary or an idea that is new to us. And we tend to sometimes be dismissive initially and perform authority, instead of saying, that is a good question, or thank you for bringing that up. Let's dig into that. Let's take just 2 minutes and dig into that, right? Instead of barreling forward with your own agenda, but to say, how do I make this a learning moment for me and for everyone else in the room? And how to not be defensive, right? To say things like, thank you for approaching me. The information you are presenting is unsettling and difficult for me, if it is. But I want you to know that I'm interested in understanding what you're offering. So keeping communication open, modeling low defensiveness. You can say things like, I want to hear you fully and be thoughtful in my response. Would you be willing to meet with me again after I've had a chance to think meaningfully about it? Right? And these are the same tools that I use in anti-racism training, because again, anti-racism is social justice for everyone, not just towards people of color, right? It's for everyone. So these tools are effective in pedagogy as well. Saying things like, I hear you and I wish to consider your feedback. May I ask you a few questions to help me situate this better in my understanding? I may fumble with my words a little. So again, it's saying, I'm not an expert in what you're asking me or what you're talking to me about, but I'd like to know more. Can I ask some questions? And that's why I say we want to question courageously. This is a slide that I pulled from another presentation where people at the time that I built the presentation were assuming the Black Lives Matter movement was a violent effort. And I had to show this picture to white audiences of Black Lives Matter protesters preventing looting of one of their local stores by forming a human chain. I'm like, do you know what the actual violence incidence rates were during Black Lives Matter protests? And again, this is the thing where misinformation, disinformation, and distortion can really get in the way in our classrooms. And so being able to not be defensive, but to say, let's get information, is where you model the learning spirit. So for me, being a teacher is not about showing up perfectly, but imperfectly, but open to change, because it's better than not showing up at all. And it teaches other people how to fall in love with learning, how to treat it as a gift and a privilege, rather than something they're entitled to just because they're paying you for it, right? But to fall in love with it so that it becomes a mutual journey. Otherwise, and I know some of you in the room can hear me on this and probably have been there yourself, isn't it easy to burn out? The grind of building a clientele, watching the revolving door, of trying to create opportunities for yourself, that can become a burnout unless you actually fall in love with learning something new about what you're doing every day. So how do we build that civility in our classrooms so that people leave the power dynamics behind and focus on that love of learning? If someone says something that works you the wrong way, here are some things you can do. Don't tell people they are wrong. Instead, ask them what value or experiences led them to those perspectives. Don't ask, how could you believe that? And instead, ask, when did that belief start for you? Don't interrupt. Unless someone is becoming abusive, then yes, it is your responsibility as the facilitator of a space to interrupt harm. But give people a chance to make sure they're done, because chances are in your presence, there is a power differential and they need a chance to organize their thinking. And instead of immediately creating a rebuttal, like, yeah, but instead try, could you please tell me more? Just leave it open-ended. Don't assume you know their motives. You might be able to taste what their motives are, but make them articulate it to you. Make them responsible for their own thoughts and emotions rather than doing the work for them as teachers. Ask them, what would you like to achieve here tonight? What's your interest? What are you hoping to achieve, right? And definitely don't blame them for your anger or frustration. That's hard to do. It's hard to do. But if you get into a confrontation with a student, explain your anger and frustration, but take responsibility for it, knowing that you are in a position of authority. Always communicating positive intent. Try to clarify and state common goals, shared meanings, and observable facts. That means at the beginning of class, you can say, my goal here tonight is to cover X, Y, and Z. Does that sound good for everybody? Do I have any special requests? Anything that you'd like for me to dig into with some specialty, right? But just checking in, establishing common goals. Trying nonviolent language when you initiate with students. I know we see things differently, but I really want to hear what your thoughts are about this. Please educate me on your perspectives and experiences. It's that diplomacy so that you become unflappable as a teacher. And then my practice of fumble forward. When you can say, I'm about to fumble with my words, and you can teach the class to say fumble forward so anyone can use the tool in the room. It means they may be confused. They may not have the right language. They may not know the terminologies, but we've all agreed through a social contract to suspend our judgment for a moment and allow confusion to be a part of what we do. So I'll, in one of my classes, say, I'm about to fumble forward. And everyone answers, fumble forward. And I say, okay, it seems to me that this is what's going on. Will you please correct me? What's your understanding of this? You know, and it means I'm not perfect in what I'm about to say. And I'm even a little confused and second guessing myself. Forgive me and help me clarify it. Give me some communication so that we can meet each other in the middle. If you have someone who is a troublemaker in the room, who does become disruptive, You can say to them after class, I wish to speak with you about a difficult topic, but I'm hoping to get past that discomfort and work towards mutual listening and understanding with you. If you need to engage a full stop in your classroom, you can say something like, I am not comfortable with what is happening here. I need 5 minutes to speak with you about it. I've had to do that. Again, I'm also dealing with college-age students who are testing their independence in the world, right? Individuating away from their parents and starting to really get testy with authority figures. So I've had to engage the full stop on occasion. You may not have to do that with your clientele. If you feel there is a lack of resolution with one of your clients or students or participants, I always say meet the moment with awareness, observe for details because you may need to recall them. You may need to report them. Do your best to do no harm. Try to plant a seed that will bear fruit in the future, even if that person isn't willing to hear you now. Don't be afraid to set a boundary. And please don't be afraid to ask for help. And remember that your modeling and your behavioral choices will sow seeds of insight and possibility that may bear fruit long after the encounter. I have the benefit of being a college professor in that students still know how to find me years after they've studied with me. And I, every year, have a little treasure trove of emails and messages and cards from students who are like, ah, I get it now. Thank you for giving me room to be a rebel. Thank you for putting up with me when I was resisting you. Thank you for understanding what I was going through. So they find me. That didn't happen so much when I was teaching in the commercial arena, but when I went into education, that cycle started to rejuvenate me of saying, yeah, I didn't reach them in the one semester that I had them, but my conduct at least made it possible for them to come back and say, I see you, and I respect us and what happened between us. And that's beautiful to me. And if someone is truly a danger to you or to themselves, get help. Get help. Check your local resources and have those resources at the ready as an instructor. You think it's all fun and games and people are showing up for a dance class until there's a meltdown, until there's a conflict, until there's a medical emergency. Have your resources at the ready. Don't wait for an emergency or a conflict to teach you what you need to do. Be ready. And I call it open heart, thick skin. Yes. In that it's really not about us as teachers. It's about pointing the way forward. You're just part of their path and you're trying to help them move forward. And that takes generosity on your part. And whenever you find yourself burned out with that social emotional exchange, I wanted to give you 3 quick quotes. The first one on the left side of your screen: develop an interest in life as you see it. People, things, literature, music, the world is so rich, simply throbbing with rich treasures, beautiful souls, and interesting people. Forget yourself. It's from Henry Miller, who was a total hedonistic weirdo. And I love what Banksy has to say. If you get tired, learn to rest, not to quit. When you find yourself berating yourself as a teacher, getting down on what you are, what's happening, rest. Give yourself a day. Give yourself a couple of days. Give yourself a season, right? And then return if you feel compelled to return. And as you receive criticism for your instruction, as you will, remember you will never be criticized by someone who is doing more than you. You will only be criticized by someone who's doing less than you. If you look at the people in your inner circle and you don't get inspired, you don't have a circle, you have a cage. So think about what kind of clients you have made your bedfellows for the work that you do. Think about not being what they need, but being sincerely yourself, so you attract the kind of people who are willing to work in the way that you do. That might take some patience, but it's worth it. Here are some resources. I invite you to screenshot this page. I have lots of pedagogy resources on my website, and I'll have that slide up next. But for now, these books, I think, are excellent starting points if some of this information felt new to you tonight. I could go on and on about each of these books, but I do want you to know that you don't have to reinvent the wheel. We forget that sometimes. You don't have to reinvent the wheel. And for additional resources, that is the information where you can connect with me and visit my website, where I have a ginormous resource page categorized into different topics. And if you find a fun resource that you think our community should know about, please send it my way. I will put it on this page. I will trust your review of the material until I can get to it myself and just put your referral on the page. And with that, thank you for listening to me. May we please move into discussion. Keishi, could I please get a time check from you? How much time do we have?
It is now 9:27 and you have 33 minutes left.
Woo! Okay, that was a lot of talk, a lot of information. I would love to open it up for discussion. I'll stop sharing my screen so we can see each other. And again, that was scratching the surface. There's a lot of neuroscience underneath social emotional learning. And one of the things that I had up on the book reference list, but I didn't cover in the lecture, is polyvagal theory, which has a lot to do with how we individually process trauma, not only in our minds, but in our bodies as well. So polyvagal theory is something that I would also recommend learning something about. The vagus nerve goes from our limbic brain into the lungs, the heart, the gut, into other central systems. And so when someone does go into trauma and gets defensive with you as an instructor, chances are the vagus nerve is firing very strongly, and it can determine where they start to go in their response, whether they freeze and start to get rigid and quiet with you and reserved and withdrawn, or whether they lean in and get aggressive and combative. And so understanding polyvagal theory is also a fascinating journey to go on if you love to geek out on neuroscience. Oh, I'm just catching up with the chat. Yay! Yes, Bettina Love. Oh, she was at CU a year ago. And I was like, I want to be her friend. The woman is badass. Feel free to raise your hand and comment. Nicole, hi Nicole. I see your hand up. Bring it on.
Okay, I had a class recently where I had one of those students who just loved to stir the pot and say controversial things, and it would, it would actually intimidate some folks. It would stimulate conversation with some folks, but it would actually intimidate some folks. And I teach a diversity class. And I get a lot of Latinos because that's my specialty. A lot of Latino students in my class, and many of them would speak out in the club, but they would not speak out in class. And they said, well, they were trying to keep their head down. And I have a sort of a welcome letter that I send out to my students before class where, we all have opinions, all opinions are welcome, but the only caveat is that you have to be polite and not flame people and so forth. And, that's kind of the understanding. But in this diversity training that I did recently, the instructor had a suggestion that maybe I should actually collaborate with the students so that they have a vested interest in deciding what was acceptable speech and acceptable sharing, and common community agreement on what was acceptable speech, so that we could all share opinions, but not be necessarily confrontational. And I don't want to keep talking, but just one more thing. It seems like contentiousness amongst my students has become a lot more dramatic in the last couple of years. And I'll stop talking now. So anyway, I wondered what you thought about some of those ideas and if you had any comments.
I'll be happy to get it started and open it up for everyone else to also share their thoughts. I would like to clarify, if I could please, are you speaking about a dance class or a general education class?
I do teach dance, but the class I was referring to is diversity. It's an academic class.
At which education level? High school, elementary, K-12?
University level.
University level. Yeah. Wonderful. Thank you very much. Yes, community agreements, which we are going to get strongly into next time I visit with you. Community agreements should be born out of, quite honestly, mutuality. It's about leaning towards mutuality. But one of the things that I always have to emphasize is emotions are permitted, abuse is not. And when someone doesn't realize that they are constantly infringing upon others in an environment, to me, that's a personal conversation off to the side to say, your mind and your comments, I am really excited to find out more about what you think. I do wonder if you notice that your words have the potential to be hurtful to others in the class. What's your goal in speaking these ways? But just to constantly give people a chance to speak to their own behavior rather than reading the behavior and telling them about themselves. I think I love what you were saying and describing in how you were seeing the class. There were a couple of words that could be culturally defined differently. So politeness is something that is culturally specific, right? Conflict is something that is culturally defined, if I may. And so I know in my Creole family, when we're sitting around and people start riffing on each other and they're snapping and they're pointing and their voices are getting loud and they'll be like, what were you thinking? And they start to really just tear into each other. It's a laughing environment. But if I were to do that in the classroom with my students, to say, what? It wouldn't be a joke to them, right? And so that's, again, where there's some cultural specificity to thresholds of conflict and what people may have been acculturated to in terms of how much playfulness or how much ugliness results in harm. So it might be interesting to actually go into building community agreements where we say, here are the 3 questions I ask my clients when I do community agreements workshops. Number 1, what do you respond to most when you feel like you're learning? When you're really enjoying learning, what are the elements of your environment? how have you responded to feedback? What are you looking for when you're really receptive to feedback? What kind of things do you want to know about yourself? And then the third question I ask is, what are you here to create? Not what are you here to learn, what are you here to create? So if they start to think of themselves as contributors to the environment, not just recipients to the environment. And after we do usually community sharing around those things, then we harvest those values and turn them into community agreements so that we have a mutual understanding of what everyone's there for. And that way we start to understand how we define things differently and where we may be culturally specific in our understanding of things like politeness, like confrontation, right? And for me, community agreements are critical because I know they take time out of the other things you're trying to do. However, without them, inevitably we have some potholes and some pitfalls that we'll bump into, right? And it's so much better if when we do bump into something like that, we have some mutual communal tools for moving forward. And learning to be able to hit the pause button when someone does become disruptive. If they say something that erupts out of their mouth, and if you need to intervene, to immediately just say, I'm going to hit the pause button on what you just said. Hey, everybody, please take a water break and let's you and I touch base real quick. Boom. Doesn't have to be a public performance, right? But you're able to just interrupt the harm by saying, I'm hitting the pause button, and regain your facilitation of the space. And if you feel that it needs to erupt further and some disruption would be useful because too much tension has built up underneath the surface, then maybe it means the class that day needs to be dedicated to community healing and sharing with you, overseeing that in a judicious way. Those are my thoughts.
Could I also comment, Tanisha in the chat brought up about
Hi,
creating.
Patricia. I know you were here.
Anyway, she talks about creating tolerance through movement, and that's something that I have been doing research with, because very often dance, drill, sports, many of these things where we have people working physically in conjunction with each other creates that muscular bonding that McNeil talks about, and creates sort of a cauldron for tolerance. So I just wanted to follow up on that. Thank you for volunteering that, Tanisha.
Yeah, I feel that bodies, forcing the river when it comes to bodies is not valuable. There's nothing to be gained. What you can do is be honest with someone about the level of risk they are assuming in trying something, and then allow them to make a choice as to how much risk they feel comfortable taking on. Instead of saying, you can do this, or this isn't hard, you'll be fine. Instead of assuring them, you can say, this might feel a little complicated and it might involve your knees, or this is going to take a little bit of low back strength. And then they get to choose whether or not they feel up to participating. And if they don't, always be ready with an alternative, which means they are still included in the classroom. They are still important to what's happening, but they get to encounter the information through a different lens, and then give them a chance to say whether or not they gain something new. I remember I was teaching jumping one day, and I had a participant who was chair bound with her wheelchair in class. And so we talked about what are the essential values of jumping. It's a lofting and a catching. So how do you feel that sense of loft and catch, even from a seated position? So the entire class chose to also try it on the ground, where they had their butts on the ground with their legs crossed and played around with the feeling of lift and catch. And then some of them also did it on their feet. We all gained additional perspectives on that information rather than just traditionally doing it from jumping up and down, right? So I think, again, opening up the ways in which we learn. And yes, Tanisha, exactly. Requesting someone's consent. I have had students where I feel like no matter how much I laid out the path for them, they wanted more from me before fighting their courage. They wanted some type of emotional assurance from me that they could try it. I have learned, and this is going to be controversial, I have learned not to play that game. That if someone is baiting me for a lot of emotional assurance for what I'm offering them, they're not ready. And I don't want to be made into the keeper of their confidence. They have to find their confidence. And all you can do is be compassionate and saying, here are the risks, here are the things that we're working on. If you don't feel comfortable trying them, let it go for tonight. Let's do something else for you. Yeah. I'm sorry, I see the chat is also moving, so I want to make sure I honor all these good comments and keep up with you. Other comments, feel free to speak your comments as well, or put them in the chat. That's good as well.
Yeah, I would love people to speak comments because we are recording this and people who are watching the recording cannot read the chat. So, Dom, continue.
Thanks, Katie. I really love this train of thought, and I wanted to get your advice on something. With dancing, I find with all types of dancing, and Middle Eastern belly dance is my background. I don't think it's a high risk, but I've been personally triggered with a trauma response in classes before. And that's something I'm really wary of as I work with other students because it's something I've experienced personally. I know having a tool set like you've already covered, this conversation about being aware and not being the keeper of that permission and that emotional piece I think is really important, but I'm curious if there's anything else that you would advise around, making sure they're aware of what might come up, ensuring that they're making a conscious choice to enter into that class with that self-knowledge and being self-responsible as students.
Mm-hmm. Dominique, that was such a brilliant question. I've learned that I, as the teacher, need to set the tone in the room that watching and taking a moment to just observe is still learning, is still equitable participation. So for example, I've had students, like if we're doing headstands in a technique class, they're like, I really don't feel safe. I'm like, no problem. Would you be willing to be a spotter for someone? Because you can learn an awful lot from spotting. Would you be willing to come with me while I work with this group as a spotter and share your observations with me? What did you see about how they use their hands? What did you see about how they were managing their shoulders? And you get them into research versus react mode so that you let it be known that there are many ways to learn and they don't have to necessarily force themselves off a cliff in order to be valuable in your eyes as a participant in the room. I thought I saw Irina. Hi.
Hi everybody. So I have a quick question and more of kind of advice that I would seek from you. Talking about cultural differences, different people talk about bodies, different cultures are talking about bodies very differently. And I've had experience in the past where older Eastern European women, and overall it's a generalization, but in my experience, something that I've grew up with, there's a certain perception of beauty. And there's a certain perception of how they can talk, how people can talk about each other. And I've experienced this where certain women would be talking about other women in class. And for them, it would be, again, as a middle-aged woman, it's kind of like, oh, you could lose a couple of pounds, that kind of thing. And I would assert my authority, I would do my best, but I know that damage has been done.
Yeah.
And it would catch me off guard because it's such a jarring thing. And I teach in different communities, and because I'm younger sometimes, and my students are older, I have a very hard time asserting my authority, where I would actually address them and talk to them like, this is not acceptable in my class. And it would be like, oh, don't, this is a joke, this is not serious, they're not taking it seriously. But it's not a language that I can find acceptable. So I find it really difficult to assert my authority and also to communicate this, because a lot of these women come, if it's in a predominantly Eastern European circle that I'm teaching, it's one standard. But when they follow me to a different community where that is extremely toxic, extremely difficult to negotiate, how do you tackle that quickly? How do you resolve this? Because I find that this is the most awful thing. I feel responsible. I feel frustrated. I feel shame because they've come, I've brought these people into a certain community that I just find it really complex to navigate, and resulted in some really unpleasant situations, which I've done my best to navigate, but I don't think I did the best that I probably could have. So I seek advice navigating these cultural differences. What is appropriate, what isn't, what is a joke, what isn't, and how do I create a safe environment? How do I kind of capture that moment that created harm? Help.
Forgive me for chuckling, because I have been in your shoes so many times. That's why I've got some recall happening here that's making me crack up. So I'm going to storytell two little quick things and let you know how I handled them. So I have been in your shoes for sure. And in one circumstance, I was invited by a group of my mother's friends to teach them a dance class as part of one of the ladies' birthday celebration. And so it was one of those kind of semi-private situations where by the time I showed up, they were already a little tipsy and having a really good time. And so I put on the music and they are just hooping and hollering and having a blast and just riffing off of each other the whole time. I realized I can't even do anything highly structured here, right? Because they're so busy tearing into each other, like, girl, I see that booty, da 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 da, and they're off to the races. And a lot of it, a little bit cutting and a little bit undermining. And I felt I had no control over the space, but I also knew they were being playful and culturally familiar with what they were doing. And in that particular circumstance, what I have found is it levels the room to do something that challenges everyone so they get away from the ability to chit chat. So ab work, where we get on the floor and we start working our core strength. So they have to start focusing on themselves rather than each other. And rather than feeling, if you can't address it in the moment, if it feels like it will be so immensely disruptive to the flow of the room and you're still trying to get a vibe for who these people are, just simply bounce into some core training. And that tends to reset the room. Double the speed on what you're working on so that, again, it scrambles and resets the room just enough that you regain their attention as an instructor. So those are covert ways of doing it until you can later have a conversation and say, you all are playful and well-meaning. I want to let you know there's someone in the class that doesn't receive it as playfully. Would you be willing to work with me on refraining from some of that? And if that doesn't go well, then that's a stronger conversation after that. But I found that bringing people into embodiment, not to take them down a peg or to humble them, but just to get them focused on their own bodies, gets them out of their social obsessions that they are digging into. The second time that I'm thinking of, I taught a class for a year at a amazing gym for differently abled and cognitively impacted adults. It was a weekly dance class in Western Massachusetts for many friends who were on the autism spectrum and may have also been negotiating sometimes Down syndrome and other cognitive impact in their lives. And control of that classroom felt very tenuous at all times because there were also clients who would vocalize very randomly. I remember every time I'd start a new movement, there was one amazing client who would perpetually narrate for me. Oh no, she's doing something new. I don't know, this might be hard. Oh, look, she's moving her hips. I don't know if I can do that. And it was always loud and it would dominate the room. But it was also her inner monologue that would just get externalized all of the time and not to be taken personally. But again, I would lose control of the space because her voice was prominent in the heads of other clients instead of the instructions that I was trying to give. And so again, those were times where I would actually set up stations in the room where I would say, okay, corner over here, we're going to work on abs. So every time you're in this corner, here's the exercise that you're doing. Corner over here, this station, we're going to work on hip bumps. And so every time we rotate to that corner, here's what we're going to do. And so I would set up stations so that instead of providing a unified platform for social performance with everyone, they started to break into their own focus groups. And that really helped to reset the space and give me a sense of diffusing any commanding of the room that was being taken up by students. So Irina, I feel you strongly on that. When it's mean-spirited, I feel I have to address it as a teacher, and I'll do it after the first class, and I'll check in with everyone about it privately first. I'll do those private call-ins. If it needs to go to another level, I have actually told students, if you are unable to refrain from this behavior, I need for you to choose another dance class to attend, you know? And that level of betrayal when a teacher uninvites someone from a learning space, to me, can be lifelong trauma. So it's the last resort for me, because to me, there's usually always a way to find some common ground. But it may mean also asking them rather than telling them, to say, did you notice when you said that comment that someone in the room exhibited some discomfort? Is that what you intended? And just constantly question and ask them about accountability rather than coming up and wagging your finger. So you're inviting them to be reflexive about their own behavior versus judgmentally reporting to them what you see. Other thoughts?
Thank you.
Oh my goodness, yes, such a good question. And again, you took me right into my own teaching trauma because I've dealt with that so many times. Does anyone else have tips and tricks to offer on that issue?
Hi. I think a lot about invitational language, right? Yeah, I teach trauma sensitive yoga, and I've ended up sort of transferring some of the language into some dance spaces too, and realizing where I already used it and where I didn't use it enough, and sort of even in our instruction, when sometimes it might be a big space and you end up having to yell out counts or something, you know, like always keeping in mind that like the tone of our language and just the demands as opposed to the invitations. Could you be curious about, could we think of our, skeletal system and our muscular system as opposed to thinking about the size of our stomach or butt, like, could we think about it in a different way? What if you just think about softening the flesh over the skeleton, or something that sort of brings it out of the realm of judgment? I've found is sometimes helps people shift their language a bit, just modeling that. Yeah, that's just sort of what I thought of when you were with that situation. Thanks.
Absolutely. Yes. And that's something that I employ regularly, even in general instructions in the class. I haven't been physically in the classroom over the last year with the COVID pandemic,
estancia, comida, acampar, y bueno, se pueden integrar, no importa durante todo el mes y puedan aprovecharla de igual manera. Y creo que por mi parte sería todo. Nos estaríamos viendo la siguiente semana para platicar acerca de los tránsitos que nos van a acompañar la siguiente semana. No se olviden de inscribirse al newsletter, de meterse al blog. Ahí está un poquito más descrito este tema de los tránsitos, que aprovechen